right, we continue now our team coverage of the first public impeachment hearings. State Department official George Kent and Ambassador Bill Taylor read opening statements to the House Intelligence Committee this morning, and we have much more that is expected to come in the coming days. Here's your morning news anchor Beth Bruce-Wall with today's In-Depth.
All right, the impeachment inquiry got underway in earnest this morning. Shortly after 10 o'clock this morning, this is how everything kicked off. Listen.
Some have argued in the president's defense that the aid was ultimately released, and that is true, but only after Congress began an investigation, only after the president's lawyers learned of a whistleblower complaint, and only after members of Congress began asking uncomfortable questions about quid pro quos.
We're supposed to take these people at face value when they trot out a new batch of allegations. But anyone familiar with the Democrats' scorched earth war against President Trump would not be surprised to see all the typical signs that this is a carefully orchestrated media smear campaign. For example, after vowing publicly that impeachment requires bipartisan support, Democrats are pushing impeachment forward without the backing of a single Republican.
Eang Ngov joining me now. You're an expert with Barry University Law School. Thanks for joining us. So we heard right there Chairman Adam Schiff and also Representative Devin Nunes of the Intelligence Committee ranking member. So lots of information to go through. We saw the statements by George Kent and Ambassador Bill Taylor. The first takeaway from listening what they had to say earlier this morning is what?
It is indicative of this measured approach that the House is using for this impeachment inquiry, that it seems that they've done their work in setting the stage for the continuation of this. And listening to Bill Taylor's opening statement, it's impressive the particularities in which he remembers
so many
the
details.
Information. Yes, so many details. And even though in some instances he didn't hear the information firsthand, it's been well recorded from whom he's heard these statements. And as was discussed in the closed hearings, that these statements seem to be corroborated by others as well. And so it's a very detailed statement in which he had given behind closed doors that we saw through the released opening statement, in which he seems to stand by and reiterate today.
And this is what it really jumps out as one of the big headlines today, right, is that for weeks, a lot of these statements have been made behind closed doors, but this is the first time the public gets to hear from these two men with very, very specific items. Now, something you just said that jumped out at me from Bill Taylor, but also George Kent mentioned, he said, and I quote, "Sometimes I heard this information firsthand, sometimes, or from or provided by others." And so as people listen to this, they've got to take that into consideration, that some of this information about any dealings back and forth with Ukraine, they heard firsthand, but others is from staff members and other people.
Sure. And generally, firsthand information is preferable for reliability because you've heard it directly. And there won't be a greater chance for misunderstanding if you heard the statements directly. But I think hearing it secondhand, though not as desirable or preferable as hearing it firsthand, doesn't negate the substance of it as you get more and more corroboration. Also, it's important to understand the credibility of these witnesses. Do they have a motive for making any misstatements in conveying information firsthand, secondhand? And so the corroboration would be very important to listen in on as we hear these statements that were heard secondhand, if they can be corroborated by others. That would lend credence to what's been heard.
One of the things that jumped out at me, and I want to hear more from you, regarding Ambassador Bill Taylor, when he made a very clear picture and describing, he says there are two channels to deal when the United States is involved in foreign affairs. There's the regular channel of diplomacy and policy, and then he calls this other channel highly irregular, and some would say throwing under the bus or just throwing names out there, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, Rick Perry, Secretary of Energy, former governor of the state of Texas, Mick Mulvaney, Chief of Staff, and the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani.
Yes, it's a bit...
Is it normal to hear like such big figures throw out the names of other big figures in such a public way?
Well, so I believe that he feels he's got a duty to disclose this information, right? Hearing his opening statement, he signified the significance of the Ukraine, the position of Ukraine in our strategic alliance. And so he sees this as a bigger picture of putting the United States and Ukraine in jeopardy. And so if his duty compels him to disclose this information, then I think that that's what he's driven by, is to disclose this information, even if it involves the big names. And it's very interesting how he describes the informal, the behind-the-scenes channel versus the official channel. And listening to his statement, it appeared to have taken him by surprise that this informal channel was happening. And having had the Foreign Affairs Service previously, I imagine that this is not a common practice. And so it's taken him by surprise that this is happening. And by terming it irregular, we see that this seems not only just not normal, but perhaps not desirable to use this informal channel as well, because then you've got two conflicting approaches to diplomacy and foreign affairs.
And it really kind of gives us an inside view, a front row view of how important it is for Ukraine to try and find its independence as it is broken away from Russia. And therein lies the other complex part of this whole thing that's going on. It's because it's, you know, the geopolitical challenges that part of the world is dealing with, and how the U.S. is involved long before President Trump.
Right. After Russia's aggression in Crimea, Ukraine is in a vulnerable position. And so Ukraine is dependent upon U.S. support militarily and aid. And I think also on the world globe, the public appearance of the United States support. And I imagine that that's probably why also the visit to the White House would be important, to give this public appearance of support that the world sees that Ukraine is important to the U.S. and is invited to the White House to then meet with the president.
A lot going on today. We appreciate your insight. Eang Ngov with Barry University, we appreciate your time.
Thank you. Glad to be here.